The federal system is minuscule compared to all of the state systems combined, but the federal system is very important because it's a bellwether. It sets the tone for what's going to happen at the state level. It can't guarantee what's going to happen, but it sets what's going to happen. So the federal prisons, on the eve of the election, for example, had ruled that you could not have juveniles in solitary confinement. Now, that didn't mean that you couldn't have juveniles in solitary confinement in Michigan, but it was very significant that the feds set a standard, right? Or that you were going to roll back mandatory minimums at the federal level. That sets a standard for other local states to follow. So it's very important setting tone, but it's a separate system and it's a much smaller system. I think that certainly the country is moving towards decriminalizing marijuana everywhere. And if I were to make a wild guess, I would guess that by the time all of today's 10-year-olds are grandparents, there won't be a state where marijuana probably isn't legal. So does that have an impact? It can have a huge impact, but again, it depends whether or not we have racial equality under the law. It depends on whether we have just policing. The state of Colorado right now, it's legal to sell marijuana, but there's still people serving substantial amounts of time for marijuana sales in that same state. And the other thing is that people are still getting busted for marijuana possession if it's not through those profit-making channels. So again, it just depends on how we police it. There is no social problem that policing and incarceration alone can fix, but there are many problems created by both of those if those are our go-to solutions. So I think, we are going to decriminalize, but it's not going to solve racialized incarceration unless we have more equal justice under the law.
Yes, my name is Otis Mathis, and I live in the southwest part of Detroit. But I live in the extreme southwest on this side of the Rouge River, the largest African-American community in southwest. And we have never been the majority. I think if you take southwest from Corktown to Michigan Avenue back across the river, we're probably 20% of the southwest side of Detroit. But when you talk about places like Brewer Park, I assume you're talking about the Stroh's Brewery area? I'm not sure where that's at.
I'll pull up the map.
Yeah. Never heard of that. So probably a lot of African Americans in Detroit. So your conversation is around something that is strange to probably most of us unless you live around there. Also,
so this is, if you can, excuse me for interrupting, just to show you what you were saying. So the map at the top is the whole city of Detroit. That's the east side that's outlined. And Brewer Park is just one, we could have picked other ones, but this map is just a Brewer Park. And in that one group, 1 in 7 adult males is under correctional control.
oh, okay, yeah. Herman Gardens, Jeffries, Brewster, something like that would have rung a bell, probably to the African American community.
And not because, let me just be clear, as I was saying, not because stuff is necessarily going on there that's not going on in a lot of houses, right, in a lot of other cities and a lot of other places, but that's where the policing is most concentrated.
Okay. Also, when you talk about the city being a part of, for everyone, and don't turn into the 67 conflict, well, the city is not being a part of everyone. You're right, whites have dominantly taken over downtown Detroit. Even the Coney Islands prices have skyrocketed on woodwork when it was a lot of homeless in the Cass Quarter and things like that. Another thing that's starting to happen is the buffer zones. The buffer zones are whites that are coming in from Warren, Michigan, the downriver communities on the edge of Detroit into the African American communities, getting these houses pretty cheap, little or nothing from land bank. So you're starting to see, if you walk off of 8 Mile in Detroit, or if you walk off of Outer Drive in the far southwest Detroit, you see more and more whites coming in. Now, Corktown and Midtown, especially Corktown, has been growing, has been majority white. People don't realize that probably since the slum lords moved to the suburbs in the 40s and the 50s, and never gave up those homes. So Detroit is pushing blacks out of the city, and they're not pushing them like in the Arabic community where they're dominating Dearborn, they're getting political power. They're spreading them out all around the state in cities that we never heard of. So whites are coming back in the edge who cannot afford to live downtown, and those groups of white-collar elites that go to Wayne State University professionals don't want them to live downtown. They just want them to work downtown, hopefully for their $15 an hour, spend it downtown, and then figure out some mass transit to push them out of downtown. Because when the jobs went in the suburbs where blacks lost jobs, there was no talk of mass transit then.
Right.
Livonia didn't even have a public bus system. Now they're setting it up where forcing Livonia to have a public bus system.
Well,
so Detroit is not coming back for everyone when you look
Right.
around. And you don't mention black projects that are more familiar to
Right.
blacks, even in
Right.
your conversation.
Right. Well, I mean, thank you for that comment, and just to kind of reinforce and reiterate some points that you made, what happens next is not inevitable. It is a policy decision. What gets built where, who it gets built for, is it built along with, say, a school? Is it built along with, say, a grocery store? Is it built including affordable units? Is it built so that it is not redlined? All of those are policy questions. And the one thing about history that we know is how we got here, but to just simply fly in the face of that and pretend like it's a blank slate. I mean, so many of the developments in Detroit it's a blank slate, right? We can just come in and do what we want. There's 700,000 plus people living here. So to your point, right, how do we do this differently? Well, these are policy questions. They're not impossible. They're not rocket science, but they do need to be deliberate.
A lot of people speak of 67 and white flight. It's an overlooked point that white flight started for 67.
Yes, exactly.
A lot of people just completely ignore that. With the expansion of the freeways, demolishing Black Bottom,
Paradise
Valley, all of that. You know, that white flight really started in the 40s in the city of Detroit, 40s, 50s. So I think it's important
Yeah,
to point that out,
totally
which
agree.
a lot of people overlook. And my experience in the city of Detroit is one that I share with many people. My family had to move 3 times before I was 18 for urban renewal. From Black Bottom, from Greektown, the corner of Monroe and Rivard at Greektown, from Mount Calm between Hastings and St. Edwine. We had to move 3 times. And it's something that still hurts. It's still a part of me. And when you talk about the city coming back, but it's overlooked the people who stayed.
Exactly.
The people who stayed, who tried to hold on to homes, who tried to hold on to businesses. And a lot of them are not getting the benefit of the money that's coming into the city or the recognition.
Yeah, thank you for
just
that.
one-
Absolutely. The white flight that begins before is very important to this story. It's also important to note, though, that in Mayor Young's election, that election, and a lot of people, I know you know this, but a lot of people don't know this. It was a contest between Mayor Young and John Nichols, who was the police chief. And it was a razor-thin election, 30,000 votes. And when the white folks who didn't want a black mayor got the verdict, that's when the city really empties out. And so this idea that white flight doesn't matter, no, it matters. It matters a lot. But it really matters the policies that were in place ahead of time and the urban renewal that moved people from house to house to house, And that's what's happening again. I mean, I think that's what this gentleman is saying, right? That people are still getting moved around, people are still getting moved from neighborhood to neighborhood as development comes in. But this is not a blank slate. Detroit has, almost 800,000 people who live here. My folks never left the city of Detroit. I grew up in the city of Detroit. This is a city of people who stayed too, not just a city of people returning. And that's got to be in the policy. I don't have those at the tip of my finger, but I can tell you that estimates right now in the United States of America of almost 100 million people have a criminal record. That should just take your breath away. So imagine what that is for the city of Detroit. And a criminal record is a permanent, as Michelle Alexander has made very, very clear, it is a permanent mark that cannot be removed. And, that's devastating for the city, absolutely devastating.
And I heard the gentleman said Focus Hope, and I look at the makeup of the team of Focus Hope.
And yeah, shout out to Focus Hope, by the way.
Yeah, they've done a great job. But there's really never been a lot of brother majority hired at Focus Hope in the city of Detroit. Let's be realistic about that. So the nonprofits is really like Southwest Solution, NSO, and others have, especially in Southwest, because when the so-called white flight, like someone said, has been going on a lot longer than '67. And then black flight happened in the '70s when the baby boomers were the best educated, were now allowed to move into some of these white suburbs. And so then they left. So that's really started hurting the city of Detroit. Similar to what we had was like the Arabic communities in Dearborn, the Latino communities, even though they may now be becoming majority in Southwest, because Southwest was, if I say Caucasian in Wayne State, white folks told me stop being so politically correct. We're white, just say white, Otis. Southwest has been majority white with Delray. So so the Latino community shop in their neighborhoods. The Arabic community shop in their neighborhood. The African American community, when they could not move out, shopped in their neighborhood. And I hate it when I hear people say, we used to own all these black businesses, and what happened? What happened when you got your degrees, you left and went to the suburbs. And as the suburbs trusted, there's always you a good black to move into their neighborhood. Now they're finding out this. Those neighborhoods need some money because these whites are moving back downtown and bringing their resources. They're bringing their offices downtown. So a lot of these suburbs now are emptying out. These office buildings are emptying out, so they're losing a tax base.
Can I just say, though, to that point, I mean, there is going to be a really interesting demographic mix-up that happens when there is this repopulation of white folks to Detroit, because there is this sense in which suburbs are very worried. As you say, they're very worried about this movement of resources downtown. Auburn Hills has suffered, right, a lot when all the stadiums come back and so forth. So the next chapter of what this is going to look like in terms of racial makeup of city and suburbs, it's going to be very interesting. If the city becomes like Brooklyn, nobody's going to be able to afford to live there.
Let me say, they've already started that chapter.
Yeah.
I've been highly blessed. I have a nonprofit, Citizens with Challenges, primary in the Southwest Downriver community that we serve, but we do pieces where we just finished studying with a grant from Jewish Vocational Service, 8 Mile and 75 from one extreme, and 75 downriver where I live at the other extreme, doing the comparison. And what found out was that whites who are losing those tax bases that cannot live downtown, don't want to come live on the edge of Detroit as others, mostly young people are coming and buying those homes in black communities. They feel comfortable enough, I guess, because there was a few blacks, and then they love the black music, so that made them more comfortable than the baby boomers and our grandparents, is that they're trying to figure out now how to get the money out of the pockets of black people in Detroit. They figured the city establishment got the tax dollars, got the fees, got the school dollars going into them and their friends' pockets, and they're not worried about, where they came from. So what they're doing now is trying to figure out how you get retirement dollars to the suburbs. And another thing we noticed is blacks is moving into these suburbs are not putting in roots. They're not buying homes. They're renting apartments. So they really are not permanent resident, they're just transient. And that when the economy comes back the way they want it to come back, those prices of those apartments are going to go up, and then they're going to be forced into limbo, like the homeless people in Cass Quarter. They're in the suburbs, but all the services, like folks, nothing against folks, those are a great program, I've worked with them, is in the city of Detroit. But there's no transportation, those Section 8 people now living in the suburb trying to get back to the services.
If I might, this is though, I mean, my hope is that as all of us residents of this metro area, this is my pitch. I mean, I'm biased, I'm a historian, but this is my pitch for getting the facts down as to why things look the way that they do. Because everything you say that is happening and might happen and could happen, it depends in large part on a willful, just almost a willful disregard for what created the problems in the first start. And so, for example, one of the reasons why we don't have a regional transit, I mean, a lot of the planners are throwing up their hands. They're all, well, what happened? It was going to be on the ballot and makes sense for everybody, and everybody likes public. What's the problem? Well, the problem is the deep history of this region. And there's a whole lot of folks living in the outer ring suburbs who this does not necessarily represent their interests, right? To have this open flow between city and suburb. And that's the reason why they moved out in the first place, is they don't want to be part of the city. And they're going to be slow to this idea that it is a metropolitan solution. But the reason why is deeply historical. The reason why is because of where we all came from and how we got where we got. And so to me, the only thing I'm adding here, I hope to be adding today, for us to think about, is that we're talking about white flight. That's on the table. We're talking about housing. That's on the table. We're talking about schools, not half enough. But we're talking about those things because those are familiar to our language. Yeah, we need schools, we need housing, we need jobs. Okay, housing, schools, jobs, housing, schools, jobs. And right on, we got to push it. I know Focus Hope is pushing on all of those things too. I know your organization is. But I'm calling out a different and really important elephant in the room, which is that if we do not start solving our social problems differently, that is to say, every time there is a crisis, we call the police. And we call the police, and this is nothing against police officers, that's their job. This is saying we're calling the police because there's no social workers to call. There are no social services anymore. We are cutting Medicaid, we are cutting Medicare. We have got to figure out that there is a way in which we are undermining everything we're trying to do with schools and jobs and housing because of this elephant in the room. Because we keep policing communities rather than assisting communities. We keep arresting communities rather than assisting communities. Because if you have a record, you can't go to school in a lot of places. You can't get financial aid to go to school. You can't get the apartment because you've got a record. You can't get the job because you have a record. So all of this, if we want to fix the city of Detroit, part of what we got to do is we got to better reentry programs in the city of Detroit. We got to have different solutions than arresting people and sending them to Ionia and Chippewa and up north. Like we just can't. And so I'm hoping what we're putting on the table today in our mix as we're thinking about moving the city forward as a metro region. And your comments just makes me think that even more how important that is. We have a lot of problems that we need to fix. And I just hope we take your wisdom and the wisdom of Detroiters who live in the city, who know what happened, know what we got to fix, but also get the narrative right about the rebellion. Go see that movie, Detroit, decide what you think. But to me, I think we've got to get the story straight about how we got in this mess before we can even begin to start solving that other problem, which is once you've destroyed a city, how are we going to get anybody to come back with means? Black people, white people, any people. And we can't do it unless the city is going to stay stable for all people, and that ain't going to happen unless we figure out how we got in this mess in the first place. I think that getting the story of what happened with the uprising is key to that, and I think understanding how devastating this war on crime and war on drugs has been for the city of Detroit is the other part of it. So thank you for your comments.
Thank you, Dr. Thompson. Thank you all for this very important conversation. Dr. Thompson will be signing her books in the back if you're interested. I really appreciate all of your participation and insightful thoughts and questions. Thank you so much for coming to the Henry Ford Museum of American Innovation. Appreciate it.